Barmston Drain cuts through East Yorkshire farmland, where long fields, straight hedge lines, and drainage banks create a hidden corridor that runs beyond easy sight. It is not deep wilderness. Farms, lanes, and villages sit close enough for routine movement and regular traffic, even after dark. That familiarity shapes the reports, because witnesses described seeing something large where they expected nothing more than foxes, rabbits, and the odd dog. Late 20th century accounts describe a dark animal appearing at the drain edge, then crossing with speed, seen most often by drivers on nearby roads. Headlights caught it only briefly, creating sharp moments of visibility, followed by immediate loss as it slipped behind banks, reeds, or hedges. Witnesses did not describe a single dramatic incident, they described repetition, as if the same stretch of land produced the same surprise more than once. Observers repeatedly described an animal larger than a typical dog, with a long, low body and a heavy presence that looked built for power. Some compared its outline to a big cat, not because of colour or markings, but because of the way it held itself close to the ground. Descriptions were cautious rather than theatrical, focused on proportion, height, and movement, instead of glowing eyes, snarls, or anything that sounded like performance. The creature was described as moving smoothly, not bounding like a startled deer, and not trotting like a casual farm dog crossing a lane. Several witnesses said it moved with control, as if it was travelling with purpose rather than fleeing from lights or noise. That impression matters because people are used to seeing animals panic under headlights, yet these accounts emphasise confidence over chaos. Most sightings were reported after dusk, when visibility drops and the drain banks become darker than the surrounding fields. Reports did not lock into a single season. They occurred across different months, which suggests the sightings were tied to location, not a short-lived event. Even so, the timing remained consistent enough to shape local expectation, with certain road sections watched more carefully during evening drives. A drainage channel offers concealment. Raised banks hide movement, while reeds and long grass break up the outline of anything travelling low. Such corridors allow wildlife to move for long distances without crossing open fields, especially if it stays close to water and cover. Witnesses often place the animal parallel to the drain rather than cutting across farmland, which suggests it used the route like a track. After some sightings, farmers reported flattened vegetation and disturbed soil on the banks, details that made sense if a heavy animal moved through reeds. Footprints were mentioned, but the ground near drains is unreliable. Rain, livestock, and routine work quickly destroy any clear impression. Because the marks did not survive, nothing could be measured, photographed reliably, or compared against known species in a way that settled debate. Some owners reported dogs barking towards hedge lines and refusing to approach certain sections of the drain, behaviour that felt different from normal fox activity. Horses were said to spook in nearby fields on evenings when people believed the animal had been seen, becoming tense and unsettled without obvious cause. Animal reactions cannot identify a species, but they can support the idea that something unfamiliar moved nearby, close enough to affect routine behaviour. Witnesses tended to reject foxes, badgers and deer because the animal appeared too large and moved in a way that did not associate with those species. They also ruled out ordinary dogs, in many accounts because of body length, speed, and the sense of weight carried low to the ground. These were not distant dots on the horizon. Several reports described close-range glimpses, brief but detailed enough to create firm comparisons. Misjudged distance is always possible at night, especially on flat land where reference points vanish and headlights compress depth into a narrow view. Escaped animals and oversized dogs exist, and rural areas can hide unusual creatures for longer than people expect, especially if sightings are sporadic. Yet repeated reports along a similar stretch of drain suggest more than one moment of error, which keeps the practical explanations under pressure. The reports stayed local because the landscape does not encourage gathering crowds. Sightings happened on quiet roads and field edges, then ended. Without a carcass, capture, or clear photograph, the story could not become a solved case, only a shared memory carried by witnesses. Over time, repetition created a pattern, a particular place, a particular kind of animal, and a familiar feeling that something was moving unseen. Barmston Drain remains ordinary in daylight, water, reeds, and working farmland, shaped by human planning and constant rural routine. At night, that same planning creates cover and corridors where a large animal could travel unseen and vanish before anyone arrives with proof. The case rests on testimony that repeats across years, describing size, movement, and location with restraint, leaving uncertainty rooted in a real landscape. The surrounding land is flat and exposed, which makes concealment difficult unless movement stays tight to hedges, banks, and the line of water. Open fields give long sightlines in daylight, so any large animal would need cover routes to avoid being noticed during ordinary farm work. That matches the reports, because witnesses repeatedly placed the animal along the drain corridor rather than crossing broad ground in the open. Many encounters happen from vehicles, where people travel the same route at similar speed and notice the same sudden shapes at the verge. Headlights produce harsh, short-range illumination, so observers register outline and motion first, then lose detail as the animal exits the beam. Because multiple drivers share that viewing setup, similarities between accounts can reflect shared conditions, not collaboration or copied stories. Sightings were often brief, yet witnesses spoke with certainty about size because the animal appeared close enough to compare with hedges, posts, and banks. Duration was short, but proximity can create strong impressions, especially when something moves with speed and unexpected confidence near a road. This helps explain why people remembered body length and gait clearly, while colour, markings, and facial features remained uncertain or not reported. There were no consistent reports of direct aggression towards people, even in close encounters, where a frightened animal might be expected to react. Likewise, there were no well-documented livestock losses pinned to the same creature, which removed one of the usual triggers for wider attention. Without escalation, the sightings stayed in conversation and memory rather than producing an organised response that might have captured evidence. Local reaction was cautious rather than panicked. People slowed on certain stretches, scanned the verge, and kept dogs close during evening walks. The story did not become a public campaign or media event. It stayed within neighbour talk, farm discussions, and quiet warnings shared privately. That restraint matters because it kept the case grounded in observation, with fewer incentives for exaggeration or spectacle. Over time, many tales grow wilder, but these accounts tended to hold steady, returning to the same core features of size, speed, and location. People described what they saw, not what it might mean, which limited the drift towards folklore framing or supernatural claims. The stability suggests the experience itself carried weight and did not require added drama to remain unsettling. Witnesses rarely reached for legends when describing the animal. They spoke of an unknown creature rather than a named monster from local tradition. They often compared it to known wildlife, only to rule those options out. focusing on physical mismatch rather than mysterious intention. By keeping descriptions practical, the reports stayed anchored to the landscape and the moment, even when answers remained unavailable. Photography was uncommon in many of the years these sightings were reported, and conditions were poor: darkness, speed, and sudden appearance. Even when people returned to look, the drain corridor offered too many exits, with banks, reeds, and hedges allowing rapid disappearance. Physical traces also failed because soft ground deforms. Rain erases, and routine agricultural movement covers marks before they can be recorded. Eventually, sightings became less frequent, then stopped, without any clear closing event, such as capture, discovery, or a confirmed explanation. The same roads were driven, the same fields worked, and the drain continued to run, suggesting the environment remained suitable regardless of outcomes. What changed was reporting itself. As attention drifted, and the absence of fresh encounters allowed the story to settle into quiet history. The strongest feature is repetition: similar descriptions, similar locations, and similar timing, coming from people who had little reason to invent. Agreement does not confirm identity, but it does suggest a shared stimulus, something real enough to generate comparable impressions across separate nights. In historical terms, that consistency becomes the record, even when the subject of the record cannot be perceived or studied directly. Barmston Drain functions like a boundary line in memory, not because it is dramatic, but because it becomes associated with a specific kind of encounter. A working landscape usually feels knowable, yet these sightings introduced uncertainty into routine routes and ordinary evenings. That is how place-based mysteries persist, through repeated small shocks that attach themselves to a map and refuse to detach. At night, the drain becomes a corridor of shadow, with banks that hide approach and reeds that break up the outline of anything moving low. Headlights carve the world into narrow slices, so an animal can appear fully formed, then vanish the moment it leaves the beam. This is not proof, but it explains how a large creature could be seen clearly enough to alarm witnesses, yet still escape confirmation. Something sizable and unfamiliar was reported moving along this drain corridor, often enough to be recognised across separate accounts over time. No lasting evidence survived weather, darkness, and routine life, leaving the story dependent on the reliability and consistency of human observation. What remains is a grounded mystery tied to a real stretch of Yorkshire land, defined by repeated sightings and the silence that followed.